who went to prison in 1950 for the alleged attempt to assassinate Harry Truman, who was in Blair House when the White House was being renovated. And he got the death penalty, and there was a big international campaign throughout Latin America particularly, and Truman decided to commute his sentence to life imprisonment. So you had 5 nationalist prisoners at this particular time, have been in prison for over 2 decades. And I decided with other lawyers that I wanted to help build a campaign for their freedom. And working with the Puerto Rican community in Puerto Rico and New York and Chicago, we built this campaign called Free the 5, Free the Puerto Rican Nationalist Prisoners. We brought a lawsuit as part of the campaign, and in 1978, one of them was freed on a medical clemency because he was suffering from cancer. And then in 1975, President Jimmy Carter gave them their unconditional release. And this was a great victory. I accompanied them back to Puerto Rico. Thousands of people were at the airport to greet them. We went on a tour of the island, met their families, and this was the beginning of my involvement with the Puerto Rican independence movement. And you may or may not know that as part of that movement, there was a group particularly based in the U.S. called the FALN, Fuerzas Armadas Liberación Nacional, which was a clandestine group that was wanting again to bring attention to the colonial case of Puerto Rico, to free the nationalist prisoners, and carried out a series of militant actions, including bombings throughout the late 70s, beginning in 74, 75, up and through 1980, demanding independence for Puerto Rico. And in April of 1980, 11 of them who had been living clandestinely were captured in Evanston, Illinois, and charged with seditious conspiracy, which was conspiracy to overthrow the authority of the U.S. government in Puerto Rico by force. And that was a big, these were now the new terrorists of the 1980s. And these were young Puerto Rican men and women who, many of whom were college students or had graduated college. Some of them were had gone in the U.S. military, who had dedicated their life to fighting for the independence of Puerto Rico. And so I became one of their lawyers and their international legal spokesman, basically. And we took their case, not only did we defend it in the U.S. courts, but we took their case internationally. We brought a petition in the United Nations on their behalf, basically saying that they're not criminals, that they're freedom fighters, and they're fighting colonialism, and under international law, colonialism is a crime, and therefore they shouldn't be put on criminal trial, they should be sent back to a neutral country. And we brought a petition in the United Nations, and I went all over to Malta and to Cuba and to Barcelona in promoting their case. I testified at the United Nations Decolonization Committee, and ultimately they just took the position that the U.S. had no right to try them. So when they were brought to court, they did not put on a legal defense, and they were given sentences between 55 and 90 years in prison. And the judge basically said, "I wish we could give you the death penalty." That was the attitude, and there was a lot of hysteria against them, and a lot of negative publicity, as you could imagine. And they started serving their sentences, and then there was a subsequent case of additional Puerto Ricans who were part of it, who were captured years later. One of them did defend himself. I was his lawyer in federal court, and they were convicted. He got probation, but the others went to prison. So we had basically 17 the new Puerto Rican political prisoners. The old ones were released in '79. after 25 years, and the new ones were now beginning, draconian sentences. So in addition to the work around Puerto Rico, I was doing a lot of work around the conditions of prison and the treatment of people in prison. And particularly, we brought a series of lawsuits against the Marion Federal Prison, who had this special isolation unit. And this was basically the forerunner of all these control units that you now hear about all over the country, including one down in southern Illinois in Tams, and Pelican Bay in California, and et cetera. They began to create this idea that you could put people in these special units based on classification and based on what their work was out in the free society, and they could be kept indefinitely locked up 23 and a half hours a day, and we began to challenge that as cruel and unusual punishment. And we were successful in some early lawsuits, and we were actually able to get 150 prisoners ordered to be released from the isolation unit at Marion Prison, including a lot of political prisoners, not only Rafael Cancel Miranda, but people who were affiliated with the Republic of New Africa, Black Panther, former Black Panthers, people who were affiliated with the Crusade for Justice, which was a Chicano Mexicano group in Denver. And so I began to learn about all these different movements from these political prisoners and began to work with them and got very close to them, and also began very close to some of the Attica brothers who now were getting out of prison after the Attica criminal cases were over. So that was a lot of the work that I did in the 70s and the 80s were around prisoner rights and around Puerto Rican independence, and also had various other political cases of activists who were involved in opposing Central America, U.S. involvement in Central America, in Nicaragua with the Contras, and in El Salvador, representing people who were arrested in demonstrations against U.S. involvement in Central America, and also working on the civil rights suit on behalf of the Attica prisoners. In the early 90s, should I just keep going?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know how much time you have, but we didn't talk about that. I have a couple questions which will lead to discussion, but I want to hear your...
I'll give and then we can go back. In the early 90s, I moved to New York to get ready for the civil rights suit on behalf of the Attica prisoners. And while I was working on that, I was asked to become the legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which was a civil rights organization, legal civil rights organization that was founded by Bill Kunstler and Arthur Kanoy when they went south to represent the civil rights movement, based in New York. And I agreed to become their legal director and worked with a group of lawyers and activists in New York, while I also worked on getting ready for the Attica case. Also, in that period of time, I also began involved in a criminal conspiracy case brought against a group called Los Macheteros, which was another Puerto Rican clandestine group that was mostly operating in Puerto Rico, but they were arrested for involvement in a conspiracy to rob the Wells Fargo depot in Hartford, Connecticut, and took $7 million from the Wells Fargo depot and got away with it, and then distributed toys to children and used that money. But ultimately, their clandestine organization was discovered, and they arrested 17 leaders of the Macheteros and transferred them by military transport from Puerto Rico to Connecticut and put them in this massive political trial in Connecticut, and I went to Connecticut to represent them and work with those Puerto Rican activists there. So I was working on the Attica civil case and the Machateros criminal case, and also another thing I was very involved with beginning in the late 70s all the way through the 80s was representing people who were subpoenaed to grand juries, because what the government was doing as a way to investigate political movements was to subpoena people to a federal grand jury and give them immunity from from their Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and then forcing them to answer questions about the activities of their political groups, and really basically creating this idea of forcing them to become informants. And if you didn't testify in the grand jury, you could go to jail for contempt, civil contempt, mostly 18 months, or maybe criminal contempt. And I represent a lot of Puerto Ricans and a lot of other activists who were subpoenaed to grand juries, refused to testify, and went to jail. I've written about grand juries extensively, and about the whole history of the grand jury and how it's been used in an improper way by the federal grand jury. So I was also active in a trial in New York, two different trials in New York. One of them was people who, after they refused to testify in the grand jury and went to jail, they were then charged with criminal contempt after civil contempt, and were put on trial in the federal court in Brooklyn, and were given 3 years for refusing to testify in the grand jury. And around that time, there was also a member of the FALN that was captured in New York, William Morales. He was blown up in a building where he was apparently making a bomb, and he went to trial in Brooklyn, New York, and he also took the prisoner of war position in court, and I was his lawyer or his legal advisor in that situation. So as I mentioned, the civil case, we tried the civil case in Buffalo, and we got a verdict on behalf of the Attica brothers, and ultimately it was appealed and it was retried, and ultimately we settled that case. And then I was living in New York from about 91 to 96, representing the Center for Constitutional Rights and doing all kinds of international law cases and as well as local cases. I brought a lawsuit on behalf of homeless people who were being beaten up and arrested for being in Penn Station. You know, basically hanging out in Penn Station and getting arrested. We got an injunction by the federal court saying they had the right to stay in Penn Station and couldn't be arrested for just being in Penn Station. And there was a whole other series of cases that we did for the center. I was involved in the beginning of the case on behalf of the Ogoni people who sued Shell Dutch for being complicit in ripping off their oil and also repressing ultimately. Nigeria? No, this is Nigeria, exactly. And ultimately taking their oil and repressing the people who were resisting, and being involved, complicit in the murder, execution of Ken Wiwa and other people involved in that case, which has gone on after I left. In about 1996, I returned to Chicago and returned to the People's Law Office and began involved in a whole new series of cases. I still maintain my relationship with the CCR as a board member, but no longer the legal director. And I began involved with several cases. One was the torture cases that were going on here in Chicago against John Burge, assisting some of the lawyers who were involved in that, and also brought this class action suit against the Department of Corrections and the phone companies for ripping off prisoners who may collect phone calls to their families. And we brought a case in court, federal court, and we weren't successful, but a whole campaign was developed around phone rights of prisoners. And then in the course of the next few years, I began to be involved with the Palestinian issue, and ultimately began to represent a Palestinian man from Bridgeview, who was accused of being a terrorist and being a member of Hamas and being involved with what was charged as a racketeering influence conspiracy.
It's an American citizen?
Yeah, American citizen since 1979. Beloved by his community, owned a little grocery store, and he had gone to, in '93, he went to the occupied territories and brought money to people who were needing it, and they arrested him, and he was tortured by the Israelis for about 80 days, and then they got a confession out of him and put him in prison for 5 years. And when he came out, he came back